They crossed my fence to measure grass that wasn't theirs. 3 days later, the entire luxury neighborhood across the road was scrambling to figure out why every sprinkler had gone silent. If you had driven past my ranch that week, you probably would have assumed I was the villain. 200 upscale homes were dealing with dying fairways, empty fountains, and angry homeowners while I was calmly repairing a barbed wire fence beneath the Texas sun. But stories like this never begin where people think they do. My name is Wade Morrison. I'm 39 years old, a third-generation cattle rancher outside Prosper, Texas. My grandfather bought this land in 1948 with money he earned after returning from the war. My father spent 40 years expanding it one pasture at a time. When he finally handed me the ranch, he didn't give me a speech about making money. He said something much simpler. Take care of the land, and the land will take care of your family. I never forgot those words. Every morning starts the same way out here. Before sunrise, I walk the fence lines, check the cattle, inspect the water tanks, and watch the sky slowly brighten over hundreds of acres of native grass. It isn't the kind of grass you'll ever see on a golf course. It grows unevenly because that's exactly how Texas intended it to grow. Mesquite trees throw crooked shadows across red dirt. Wildflowers appear whenever they feel like it, and every fence post carries scratches from decades of weather. To some people, it looks rough. To me, it looks like home. My wife, Sarah, feels the same way. She moved here after we got married and somehow adapted to ranch life faster than I ever expected. 6 months pregnant with our first child, she still insisted on helping with paperwork in the evenings and feeding calves whenever I wasn't looking. We had already painted the nursery, argued over baby names, and imagined what it would be like teaching our daughter to ride a horse across the same fields where 4 generations of my family had grown up. We believed life was finally settling into something peaceful. Then Meridian Heights arrived and changed the rhythm of everything around us. The development had transformed former ranch land into one of the most expensive communities in the county. 200 modern townhomes surrounded an immaculate golf course. Decorative ponds reflected rows of luxury homes with identical landscaping. 5 swimming pools sparkled beneath carefully positioned palm trees. Tennis courts, walking trails, a private clubhouse, and endless rows of bright green grass stretched almost to my eastern fence line. Every morning at exactly 5:30, hundreds of sprinklers rose from the ground in perfect synchronization, spraying enough water to create a light mist over the fairways. The contrast between our properties couldn't have been more obvious. On one side stood generations of working ranchland shaped by nature and necessity. On the other stood a neighborhood designed to look perfect from every angle. At first, we barely noticed each other. Then small complaints started arriving in my mailbox. Someone claimed my pasture grass looked unkempt from the 7th hole of the golf course. Another letter suggested my old cattle trailer reduced the scenic value of nearby homes. A third complained that my livestock occasionally wandered too close to the fence, making golfers uncomfortable. None of the letters came from county officials. They all came from the Homeowners Association. I ignored every one of them. Their rules applied inside their neighborhood, not on my family's ranch. Months passed before the complaints became more aggressive. Instead of simple letters, I began receiving printed photographs taken from across the fence line. Red circles highlighted patches of native grass. Arrows pointed toward old barns and livestock pens as though someone were preparing evidence for a courtroom. One notice actually suggested replacing sections of native pasture with decorative landscaping to improve neighborhood appearance. I laughed out loud when I read that one. Decorative landscaping on a cattle ranch might have been the funniest idea I'd ever heard. Looking back now, I think my silence convinced them they could push a little farther every time. The Sunday that changed everything started like any other. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when I heard the sound of an electric motor somewhere beyond the barn. At first, I assumed one of my ranch hands had arrived early, but the sound was too quiet to be a truck and too steady to be farm equipment. Carrying my coffee onto the porch, I looked across the pasture and froze. A white golf cart was driving slowly across my property. Two people wearing matching polo shirts stepped out beside a patch of tall native grass, carrying a tablet, a hard equipment case, and a compact drone. One launched the drone while the other began pointing toward different sections of my pasture and making notes. For several seconds, I honestly believed they had entered the wrong property by mistake. Then I watched one of them kneel beside my fence line and stretch a measuring tape across the grass while the drone hovered overhead, recording everything. They weren't confused. They believed they had every right to be there. I climbed into my pickup and drove toward them, but before I reached the fence, both individuals calmly packed their equipment, climbed back into the golf cart, and headed toward the eastern boundary. By the time I arrived, they had already disappeared into Meridian Heights. Hanging neatly from one of my fence posts was a laminated notice warning that my property had been photographed for an alleged agricultural blight concern and that additional complaints could be submitted to local authorities if conditions failed to improve. I pulled the notice from the wire, shook my head, and was about to throw it into the truck when something near the bottom of the fence caught my attention. 2 strands of barbed wire had been cut cleanly apart. Fresh scrape marks shined where bolt cutters had sliced through the steel only minutes earlier. Tire tracks passed directly through the opening into my pasture before disappearing back toward the subdivision. I crouched beside the damaged fence in complete silence. This was no longer about grass, photographs, or annoying letters. Someone had deliberately entered private property after cutting a working ranch fence. At that exact moment, I heard Sarah call my name from the porch, and when I turned around, I saw the worried expression on her face. Neither of us realized it then, but that damaged section of fence was about to change far more than either neighborhood could possibly imagine. Sarah walked toward me as quickly as she could, one hand resting protectively against her stomach. The moment she saw the damaged fence and realized strangers had been standing inside our pasture only minutes earlier, the color drained from her face. I tried to reassure her that everything was under control, but I could tell she wasn't listening anymore. She kept looking toward Meridian Heights as though expecting someone else to come driving across the field. By lunchtime, she complained of a pounding headache and dizziness. At first, she insisted it was nothing more than exhaustion, but when she suddenly had to steady herself against the kitchen counter, I grabbed the blood pressure monitor we kept in the cabinet. The numbers on the screen were high enough that neither of us said a word. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in the emergency department while nurses moved far faster than I wanted to see. The doctor explained that elevated blood pressure during pregnancy could have many causes and that reducing stress immediately was one of the most important priorities. Sarah was admitted for observation while I sat beside her bed, replaying the morning over and over in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the drone hovering over our pasture and the clean cut through my grandfather's fence. I realized something then. The damaged wire could be repaired in an afternoon. What I couldn't repair so easily was the feeling that my wife no longer felt safe in the only home we had ever planned to raise our child in. After Sarah finally fell asleep, I drove back to the ranch just before sunset. The place felt unusually quiet. Even the cattle seemed calmer than I was. Without really thinking about where I was going, I found myself walking toward the old equipment shed near the western pasture. My grandfather had built it decades earlier using rough cedar beams that still carried the smell of machine oil and weathered wood. Most visitors assumed it held nothing more than ranch tools and spare parts, but almost every important utility system on the property originated inside that building. Hanging on one wall were faded maps showing underground water lines that had been installed over several generations. My father believed in keeping records for everything. Every repair, every easement, every agreement, every survey, every receipt had been carefully labeled and stored in metal filing cabinets that looked older than I was. I opened the largest drawer and began searching through folders simply because I needed something practical to focus on instead of worrying about Sarah. Half an hour later, I found a binder marked Development Agreements, 2015. I remembered the year immediately. That was when Meridian Heights was still nothing more than bulldozers and construction trailers. The developer had approached my father asking for temporary cooperation while municipal infrastructure was still being completed. Dad mentioned signing a limited agreement that allowed certain utilities to cross a portion of our land during construction, but I had never paid attention to the details because the project seemed temporary. I carried the binder to the workbench and slowly turned each page. Survey maps, correspondence, easement diagrams, payment receipts. Then I reached the agreement itself. Several paragraphs described temporary access arrangements, followed by a section outlining conditions under which those arrangements could be modified or terminated. I read every sentence twice before reaching for my phone. Instead of making assumptions, I called the attorney who had represented our family for years. Early the next morning, he agreed to review the paperwork. We spent nearly an hour discussing every clause line by line. His advice was straightforward. Before making any decision, document everything. Preserve evidence. Communicate only in writing. Avoid emotional confrontations. Most importantly, understand exactly which rights belong to our family and which belong to the neighboring development. That conversation changed my entire approach. Instead of reacting out of anger, I began preparing carefully. I photographed the damaged fence from every possible angle before repairing it. I saved security camera footage showing the golf cart entering the pasture. I organized copies of every complaint letter the HOA had previously mailed to us, arranging them in chronological order to show how the conflict had gradually escalated over time. I even marked tire tracks across the pasture before the next rain could wash them away. Every piece of information went into a single binder. If anyone questioned what had happened, I wanted facts instead of opinions. 2 days later, while Sarah remained under strict instructions to rest as much as possible, I sent a formal letter requesting that the HOA cease entering or photographing my property without permission and asking them to preserve any internal records related to the inspection conducted that Sunday morning. I expected either silence or another aggressive response. Instead, 3 board members appeared at my front gate that afternoon insisting they had done nothing wrong because, according to them, the condition of my ranch affected the visual experience of homeowners and golfers. I politely informed them that our conversation would remain at the gate and that any future communication should go through legal representatives if necessary. One of them laughed and suggested nobody would take a rancher seriously against a wealthy homeowners association. I didn't argue. I simply wished them a good afternoon and watched them drive away. What they didn't realize was that every unnecessary visit, every letter, and every dismissive remark only strengthened the documentation already sitting inside my office. Over the following week, the atmosphere between the ranch and Meridian Heights changed completely. My neighbors on the rural side of the county quietly stopped by to ask whether everything was all right after hearing rumors about the dispute. Several longtime residents remembered my grandfather personally and encouraged me to stand my ground without creating unnecessary conflict. Their support reminded me that respect had always been the unwritten rule out here. You respected property lines, you respected your neighbors, and if disagreements happened, you solved them face to face rather than pretending someone else's land belonged under your authority. Standing at the repaired fence one evening, I looked across the immaculate golf course toward rows of identical houses glowing in the setting sun. It struck me that 2 completely different ideas of ownership existed only a few hundred yards apart. One side believed control came from rules printed inside a binder. The other believed ownership carried responsibility, patience, and respect. Neither side realized how close those 2 worlds were to colliding, and I had a feeling the hardest part of the story hadn't even begun. The following Monday began with an unusual silence. For the first time since Meridian Heights had been built, nobody crossed the fence, no drone hovered above the pasture, and no complaint appeared in my mailbox. I almost convinced myself the letter had worked. Maybe their attorney had finally explained where the property line ended. Maybe common sense had returned. Around noon, my phone rang. It was the attorney who had reviewed our family's records. He told me another package had arrived from the HOA, this time demanding access to inspect what they described as a shared utility corridor. He paused for a moment before asking if anyone had ever discussed that phrase with me. I told him no. He chuckled softly and said, "I thought so." According to the documents he had reviewed, Several utility arrangements between the original developer and surrounding landowners have been temporary accommodations made during construction. They did not automatically give future HOA board members unlimited authority to enter neighboring private property whenever they pleased. Hearing that didn't make me feel victorious. It simply confirmed something my grandfather had taught me years earlier. Most conflicts don't begin because people misunderstand the rules. They begin because someone convinces themselves the rules shouldn't apply to them. That afternoon, I drove every fence line again, replacing 2 weathered posts and reinforcing the section that had been cut. While I worked, golfers continued playing only a few hundred yards away, completely unaware that the people running their community were creating problems most residents probably never wanted. I couldn't blame the families living there. They bought homes, not arguments. Children rode bicycles along quiet streets. Couples walked dogs after dinner. Retired neighbors tended flower beds. They were my enemies. The conflict existed because a handful of people believed authority could extend beyond the neighborhood they governed. 3 days later, another certified envelope arrived. This time the language was noticeably more cautious. Instead of accusing me of violating neighborhood standards, they requested a meeting to discuss ongoing concerns affecting adjacent properties. My attorney advised accepting the meeting, but documenting everything. We agreed to meet in a neutral conference room at the county offices rather than on either property. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Their representatives argued that maintaining good relationships benefited everyone involved. My attorney calmly replied that good relationships normally begin by respecting property boundaries. They suggested creating a cooperative inspection process. We declined. They proposed future landscaping discussions. We declined again. Finally, they asked what outcome I actually wanted. I answered with one sentence. I want my family left alone. The room became quiet after that because there really wasn't anything else to negotiate. My ranch had existed long before Meridian Heights. It would likely remain there long after every current board member had moved away. I wasn't interested in winning a feud. I simply wanted the same respect my family had shown every neighboring property for generations. Over the next several weeks, something unexpected happened. The aggressive letters stopped completely. Instead, routine communication came through attorneys whenever absolutely necessary, and even those messages gradually became less frequent. The repaired fence remained untouched. Security cameras recorded cattle, deer, and coyotes instead of unauthorized visitors. Sarah slowly regained her confidence as each peaceful week passed. We spent evenings back on the porch talking about our daughter's future instead of discussing legal documents. The ranch finally began feeling like home again instead of the center of an argument. Months later, when our daughter was born healthy, I carried her outside just before sunset. The pasture stretched toward the horizon exactly as it had when my grandfather first walked this land decades earlier. Beyond the eastern fence, the golf course looked just as green and carefully maintained as always, but it no longer represented conflict in my mind. It simply reminded me that neighbors don't have to live the same way to respect one another. Looking down at my daughter, sleeping peacefully in my arms, I realized that protecting a family isn't always about dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's about remaining calm while everyone else expects you to lose your temper. Sometimes it's about keeping careful records instead of raising your voice. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly where your responsibilities begin and where someone else's authority ends. My grandfather once told me that fences aren't built because neighbors hate each other. They're built so good neighbors can stay good neighbors. I didn't fully understand what he meant until all of this happened. The strongest boundary on any piece of land isn't made of wire, wood, or steel. It's made of mutual respect. The day someone decides that respect no longer matters is the day every unnecessary conflict begins. If this story has a lesson, it isn't about ranches, homeowners associations, or property lines. It's about remembering that every decision carries consequences, every action leaves a mark, and treating people fairly is almost always less expensive than trying to control them. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation. And if you like long-form stories about land, justice, and standing your ground without losing your integrity. Don't forget to subscribe because the next story is already waiting.